Thank you very much. For more now on the remarkable, and it really was a remarkable life. You think of everything he did from the age of 19, Bush 41. Let's bring in fellow Texan Congressman Louie Gohmert, who attended the funeral today, and Jane Hampton Cook, a White House staffer for President George W. Bush, along with our panel. Congressman, I want to start with the Texas side of the whole thing. He wasn't a Texan. He was a Northeast guy, born to a famous and well-off father, but he moved to Texas, gave it all up, and sort of became a Texan. I think the fact that he had that can-do spirit really endured him to a lot of Texans, no?
Well, he fit right in, and especially you can't go to Odessa in West Texas without becoming a Texan if you're there any time at all. But, you know, just the fact that when he turned 18, the day he turns 18, he goes and enlists and is going to be a pilot and served in the country, in our military, was shot down. I mean, it's an amazing story. And then all of the things he did, and yet, as the different speakers pointed out, there probably wasn't a day that went by when he didn't wonder, you know, why me, Lord? You know, why was I spared? But we all know that we can look back at the road he traveled and see he made a difference. As some said, you know, he was the perfect president. Perhaps nobody could have handled it as well in the reunification of Germany after the fall of the Iron Curtain. But you know, being a baseball fan and a baseball player, of course he played at Yale, but Houston was his home, and that's all we ask in Texas. You love Texas, you declare it home, and he did all of that. And he made the state a better place, and that included through his son, George W., as governor and then as president. But, you know, and the funeral, you know, 2 hours, you might think that would be too long, but it was like a good book or a good movie. It makes you laugh, it makes you cry. There were great lines that were really funny. Alan Simpson did a great job. Meacham, the historian, did a terrific job. But I loved Simpson's line, I believe said, he was a man of great humility, and when you travel the high road of humility in Washington, you don't see heavy traffic.
Congressman, I thought it was a very moving funeral, and saw James Baker sobbing, and as we just watched the son get very emotional, George W. Bush. Was that the feeling? And it almost seemed like we were celebrating the end of an era or the passing of a generation with this funeral, not just the passing of a wonderful man.
Well, you're right, and you would know, but Meacham pointed out that this was perhaps the last warrior statesman to be president, and obviously he was. But you nailed it. I mean, that was the feeling. And of course, when there is so much tension and emotion, and even where a tough guy like Jim Baker is sobbing, it takes everybody with them. And I didn't see anybody, I don't believe, that at some point didn't have tears rolling. It was a great tribute and eulogy to a great man. God was glorified, and for a Christian, that's as good as it gets.
Jane, I got a question about GW and the influence of his father on him. When you asked him invariably what he was most proud of, it was something a lot of people don't think of. It was maintaining the dignity of the office, which had gone through a trial in the era of the Clintons. That clearly, from my perspective, seemed to come from his father, no?
Absolutely. And I've been reading a lot of his letters from the 1970s, George H.W. Bush's, and you can see that leadership was really what drove him. Dignity, public service was a noble calling. He told his sons during Watergate, don't get discouraged. I want you to, at some point in your life, give back. And he said, I want you to crank it back in. And I think upholding the dignity of the office was really the driving philosophy. For Reagan, it was about what? We're going to lower taxes, limited government. But for George H.W. Bush, it was how to lead. Here's a leadership style. And I think George W. Bush brought that to his own presidency, the style of leadership, dignity, returning dignity to the office. And I think that was really beautiful. And I'll just say, today was very historic. When John Adams died, John Quincy Adams was president. He couldn't get back very quickly to Massachusetts. So today was the first time we've had a son who was also a president eulogize his father, who was the president. Very historic day.
Congressman,
Jane, this is Gary Smith in Florida. Just the two questions. 20, 30 years from now, how do you think President Bush will be remembered? And maybe you kind of alluded to that with some very nice remarks. And do you think a president like him could get elected today or tomorrow?
Well, I think that, you know, that the grace and the dignity and that leadership style, you know, he was very well mannered, George H.W. Bush, as was George Washington. I think historians will look and see that there's a parallel. I think there's always a time for good manners. And I think what's challenging is that Republicans have taken it so hard from the press over the years. After Watergate, George H.W. Bush hoped that the press would return to fair play. And I think that one reason why we have President Trump is just this exacerbation with wanting fair play. So he counterpunches hard because of the way the media is now. So I think there's always room for a George H.W. Bush at the table and his leadership style. I think that the context is just a lot different right now.
Congressman, I have a question. Congressman, do you think with all this remembrance, because there was a real economic legacy too with this president that's very different than the way things have evolved in this country, do you think we get a swing back to a more pro-globalization, pro-bipartisan deal-making that is more typical of the kind of policies that happened in that era?
Well, I don't think you're going to see it in the next 2 years, and hopefully not for years to come, because the best thing that could happen to the world is the United States gets stronger. I've heard that from people in Nigeria, Togo, the Middle East, Egypt, and I mean, all over the world, you name it. A strong America is good for the world, and I think that's what you're going to need to see for a while. But I do think there will be, I mean, everything's cyclical, but you'll see a time when another warrior statesman, with emphasis on the statesman, will be able to be elected. But, you know, in the last couple of days, I've heard over and over, and so often it's from people that want to make a slap at President Trump about how gracious President H.W. Bush was, and he was. He was an amazing man in that regard. But people have, in their effort to slap at Trump, have failed to give him the credit. They've talked about, yeah, he enlisted and all that, but this guy's a fighter. I mean, he got knocked down and he got back up, and that always happens in the oil business, and he was able to go down and get back up. He was shot, went up, got shot down even at the early age. And then, you know, he ran, I believe it was against Lloyd Benson, and it sounded like this George H.W. Bush was probably the most qualified guy to ever run for the Senate, and Texas didn't elect him that time. He got shot down, and what has happened? He comes right back up. This guy was a fighter, but he could do it with elegance and grace, and that's what's usually missing. And the mention of George Washington and parallels there. Washington was a fighter. He was sometimes right down to the front of so that the guys would not retreat and run away because he knew they wouldn't leave him there by themselves. So people sometimes neglect that that fight in the
he was a real historic
and he certainly
figure.
Had it.
He sure did. Congressman, great pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. Jane Hampton-Cook, great to see you as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Emotional day. Thank you.
Hope to see you soon. Ohio law